It was early October at John F. Kennedy International Airport, and the terminal buzzed like a beehive. Families waved goodbye in the bright morning sun streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Travelers tugged rolling suitcases over gleaming tile floors as the public address system called group after group. Amid the clatter of heels and suitcase wheels, two siblings, Grace Williams and her younger brother Peter, stood calmly at gate 23. They wore crisp outfits chosen for their grandmother's 80th birthday in Chicago, and Grace held a small box wrapped in shimmering gold paper like a precious secret. Both held first-class boarding passes in their hands, each pass printed with a barcode, a seat assignment, and the promise of comfort miles above the earth. When their group was called, Grace and Peter stepped forward side by side, each moment carrying hope of a quiet flight. The gate agent smiled and scanned their passes with a gentle beep, then slid the plastic cards back across the counter. "Enjoy your flight," she said, her voice warm with professional courtesy. Without a word, Grace tucked the pass into her purse, and Peter adjusted the strap of his leather messenger bag. They walked through the jet bridge, the tunnel's walls lit by recessed lights guiding them toward the plane's door. Behind them, other travelers rounded the corner, unaware of what was about to unfold. The first-class cabin felt like stepping into a private lounge rather than an aircraft. The temperature hovered at a comfortable 72 degrees Fahrenheit, controlled by hidden vents above each row. Soft jazz played from concealed speakers while overhead bins clicked shut as passengers stowed their belongings. Grace slipped into seat 2A, her 6-inch heels resting on the plush carpet. Peter settled into 2B and glanced toward the window, where the runway stretched out in neat strips of asphalt and concrete. Other passengers sipped 12-ounce cups of coffee and leafed through morning newspapers. A flight attendant passed by offering warm towels scented with a hint of lemon. Almost immediately, tranquility shattered when Heather Smith appeared in the aisle, her 5'9" frame commanding attention. Heather is the senior flight attendant on this flight, and her uniform was pressed so sharply it looked as though it might cut. She stopped in front of Grace and Peter, folding her arms as if bracing for a battle. "Excuse me, are you sure you belong here?" she asked, in a tone that carried an icy edge. Grace smiled politely and held out her boarding pass. "We have first-class seats," she said softly. Heather stared at the pass as though it were a puzzle she refused to solve. Finally, she handed it back without a word and said, "We will see." Her gaze flickered over Grace's gold bracelet and Peter's neatly pressed blazer, as if she doubted they could afford first class. Grace's smile faded, and Peter's hands curled into fists in his lap. The gentleness of that cabin moment lurched into tension. Grace forced her shoulders to relax, but she felt like a deer caught in headlights. The other passengers glanced their way with polite curiosity, but no one intervened. Another 10 minutes passed. Engines roared to life beneath the floor panels, and the cabin lights dimmed to a mellow glow. Heather returned, this time standing directly in the aisle blocking their view. Her tone had lost its pretense of civility. "I need you to move to the back," she said without explanation. Peter looked up, calm but firm. "Why must we move?" he asked. Heather crossed her arms. "Those seats are now required for other passengers," she replied. "Please gather your belongings and come with me." Grace felt her heart stutter. Her cheeks warmed as she clutched the gold-wrapped box to her chest. "We did nothing wrong," she whispered to her brother. Peter leaned close, his voice steady. "We are not leaving these seats unless the captain orders it." Heather's eyes narrowed. "If you refuse, I will call security," she threatened. Her words rang through the cabin and heads turned. Grace swallowed hard and pressed her fingers against the gift, trying to keep her voice even. "There must be some mistake," she said. Heather's jaw tightened. She snapped her fingers at another flight attendant standing nearby. "You see these seats," she said, her tone loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "They are mine to manage." She tapped the tip of her index finger on her name badge as if that alone bestowed authority. The second attendant shifted uncomfortably before stepping back. Grace bit her lip to stop the tremor in her voice as she looked around. Even the passengers with tickets in coach glanced in their direction now. A soft murmur rose in the cabin. Passengers exchanged uncertain glances, whispering behind hands. Some looked surprised, while others furrowed their brows in disapproval of Heather's behavior. Grace's throat felt tight with humiliation. She had never been made to feel less than human for simply sitting in a seat she paid for. Peter leaned over and slipped his hand into hers. Her fingers were cold and clammy, but his grip was steady. He nodded at her to stay calm. Heather bent toward Grace and spoke close enough that her breath brushed Grace's hair. "You are not making this easier for yourself," she hissed. Grace held her ground. "Please, Heather, we only want to go to Chicago to celebrate our grandmother's birthday. Let us stay in our seats," she said softly. Heather straightened and folded her lips into a thin line. "I can do this all day," she said. "Give me a reason not to call security." Grace's eyes filled and a single tear trailed down her cheek. Her voice came out husky and low. "I cannot bear this humiliation," she said. "Please, show me some kindness." The word kindness hung awkwardly between them. Heather looked away, her gaze hard and unyielding. In that moment, Grace pulled out her phone and opened her contacts. She tapped familiar names until she found one. Peter watched as she whispered into the screen. Heather backed toward the galley, her strides quick and rigid. She did not bother to hide her anger, her uniform jacket pulling at her shoulders as she marched off. Grace closed her eyes, fighting tears, and leaned her head against the seat's headrest. The quiet hum of the engines felt suddenly oppressive, like a storm ready to break. Peter reached into the seat pocket in front of him to retrieve an airline-branded magazine and pretended to flip through it. He could feel every pair of eyes in the cabin on them, some filled with curiosity, others with sympathy. Grace wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her blouse and tried to steady her breathing. Her fingers trembled around her phone as she typed another message. She hit send and returned the device to her purse, her hand lingering on the zipper. A few moments later, Heather reappeared at the front with a coworker. The second attendant was young and seemed uncomfortable with Heather's intensity. Heather whispered something sharply to her before marching back toward row 2. Grace and Peter exchanged a glance of dread. Heather stopped about 3 rows ahead and spoke into her radio earpiece, her voice clipped and urgent. Peter's jaw clenched. He whispered to his sister, "Stay calm and wait for me to speak." Grace nodded, her heart pounding like a drum. Heather lowered her voice just enough for them to hear. "We cannot allow this to continue," she said. "They have already cost us a gate change and a delayed departure. I will not let them ruin this flight for everyone else." The words gilted her weapon of authority into a sharper edge. Passengers shifted in their seats again, the cabin no longer relaxed. Grace felt warm tears roll down both cheeks. Peter set a hand on her shoulder and offered a small smile. "We will not be moved," he whispered. Heather's lips pressed into a hard line and she turned away again. Her polished shoes clicked on the carpet as she strode to the front, leaving Grace and Peter to absorb the weight of her contempt. For a silent minute, the siblings sat in anxious stillness. Then the plane's intercom handset clattered as Heather lifted it and spoke into the handset. Grace and Peter exchanged a look but did not interrupt. She spoke into that small microphone with a voice that wavered between anger and fear. What she did not know was how quickly her actions would backfire. But in that moment, she felt in control. The co-passengers sat frozen, listening as Heather delivered her report. Grace closed her eyes and inhaled slowly. She thought of her grandmother waiting in Chicago and the smile on her face when she saw her gift. She thought of the cake with chocolate frosting and the balloon decorations dotted around Grandma's living room. None of that felt real here in this cabin, but it gave her strength. Peter slipped an arm around Grace and whispered, "You are safe with me." Grace leaned against him and nodded. The cabin lights remained dim. The jazz resumed softly as if nothing unusual had ever happened. But every passenger now held a newfound respect for the siblings who refused to give in to unfair treatment. and every eye in the cabin bore witness to the first chapter of a story that had only just begun to unfold. Meanwhile, Heather retreated to the rear of the cabin, each step slower than the last. She slid into an empty jump seat beside the galley and closed her eyes for a moment. Her heart thundered in her chest at 200 beats per minute, her breathing coming in shallow gasps. Sweat beaded at her hairline and dampened the collar of her uniform. She clasped her hands tightly in her lap, pressing her knuckles into her palms in an effort to steady her trembling arms. Around her, life in first class tried to resume. A flight attendant offered a glass of water to the passenger in seat 3C. A man in seat 4A cleared his throat and adjusted his neck pillow. But for Heather, the world had shrunk to the panicky rhythm of her own pulse. She hovered on the edge of panic and professional pride, unsure which would break first. And while she fought to steady her breath, Grace and Peter waited in row 2, poised for whatever would come next. Heather pressed her back against the overhead bin, her knuckles whitening as she gripped its edge. Every heartbeat thundered in her ears, echoing the calm, controlled tone of Richard Carter's voice over the intercom. 12 years of climbing the ranks, 3 promotions, and not a single blemish on her record now meant nothing. She recalled seeing his face only once before in a sterile corporate video, a headshot across from bullet points on leadership. Never did she imagine hearing him speak directly to her, ordering her suspension mid-air. The hum of the engines under the floor panels felt like a war drum, matching the rapid pace of her thoughts. She closed her eyes, counting breaths. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. Trying to summon composure she no longer felt, but the soft clicks of camera phones and the low murmur of passengers' whispers cut through any peace she might find. She pushed her forehead against the cool metal, as if it could absorb her shame and leave her unburdened. Heather's throat constricted. "I did not know who they were," she whispered. The manager's gaze sharpened. "That is irrelevant," he replied. "Their boarding passes were valid. Your bias was the issue, not their identity." The words landed like stones in her gut. She rose, shoulders stiff, and walked back into the cabin under a canopy of silence. No applause greeted her, no cries of outrage. Just a hush that felt colder than any wind at 35,000 feet. Grace rested her head on Peter's shoulder, the gold box tucked securely at her side. "Do you think she knows her career is over?" she asked softly. Peter shook his head. "Not yet," he replied, "but she will." Outside the window, the tarmac stretched into the distance, runway lights blinking like sequins sewn into black fabric. Inside the cabin, strangers shared nods of approval and relief. A woman half a row away wiped her eyes. A man 2 rows back leaned forward and whispered to his wife. "I am proud of them." The captain's voice returned over the intercom, polite and composed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We will remain on the runway for a few more minutes while ground operations proceed. Thank you for your patience." No one clapped, no one cheered. Instead, a calm acceptance settled over first class. Passengers returned to their seats, adjusting belongings, yet the atmosphere had changed. Every cup of coffee poured and napkin unfolded carried a new respect for Grace and Peter. Heather sat alone in her jump seat, gaze fixed on the carpet as though it held the answers. Her uniform felt like a costume she no longer fit into. She replayed her words, her assumptions. The moment she looked at 2 well-dressed teens and decided they did not belong, she thought of her 12 years of service and how quickly it could be undone. A soft knock came at the galley wall, and Claire slipped back inside. "I believe in second chances," Claire said quietly. Heather lifted a pale hand. "I fear I may have lost mine," she replied. Up front, Peter caught Grace's eye. "I never expected standing up to feel so powerful," he said. Grace wiped at her cheeks. "I never thought kindness could be such a weapon," she replied. They leaned against each other, the gold box between them a reminder of home. Around them, business travelers and vacationers alike settled in again, but their glances toward row 2 carried something new. Respect. He reached over and placed a steady hand on her arm. "I know," he said softly. "You did nothing wrong." A single tear escaped the corner of her eye. She blinked it away before anyone could notice. "Why did she hate us?" Grace's voice cracked on that one word. Peter paused, choosing each syllable as carefully as he had his steady protest. "Some people do not need a reason," he said finally. "They just think they are better." At that moment, an older woman seated across the aisle leaned forward. She had gentle gray hair tucked neatly behind her ears and kind eyes that crinkled with empathy. "I saw everything," she said quietly. Her voice was rich with experience and warmth. "You two did not deserve any of that, and she knew it didn't make sense even before your uncle spoke up." Grace offered her the tiniest smile in gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. The stranger nodded. "And for what it's worth, I have flown with this airline for 20 years. That voice on the intercom is not some figurehead. That man built this entire company." Peter drew in a breath that he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Hearing that truth from a stranger made it all feel more real, more like a victory born of quiet courage. Across the cabin, muted lights cast soft glows over passengers' faces, many of which were now turned toward row 2 in solidarity rather than judgment. She looked up at Claire, eyes wide with disbelief. "Before we land?" she whispered. Claire nodded. "They do not want you stepping off the plane in uniform." The weight of the humiliation crushed Heather's chest. In all her years with the airline, she had never heard of anyone stripped of their badge and escort mid-flight. The document felt like a confession of her unwritten sin. The sin of judging two black teenagers based on a snap assumption, not policy, not procedure. Slowly, Heather reached up and unclipped her name badge. The metal felt colder than any ice she'd ever touched. Her name, printed in gold letters, Heather Thompson, Senior Cabin Supervisor. She had worn that badge like a shield, a mark of competence and authority. She had fought for it, defended it fiercely. Now it was just plastic, meaningless in the face of her misjudgment. She handed it to Claire, who accepted it solemnly before stepping back. Heather sank deeper into the jump seat, now bare of rank, bare of pretense. For the first time in years, she felt powerless. Back up front, the cabin door remained sealed, but nothing, and no one, was the same. Power had shifted. It no longer rested on a crisp uniform or an assertive voice. It belonged to two teenagers who had sat in silence, refused to yield seats they had every right to occupy, and allowed a simple phone call to topple a tyrant's day. Grace closed her eyes, leaning into Peter's steady presence. She felt the world around her vibrating with tension and relief in equal measure. She knew they had done the right thing, but they did not celebrate. They just waited, poised and composed. Peter watched the cabin's older passengers and seasoned travelers for any sign of continued animosity. Instead, he saw respect. An older man in a business suit nodded at them across the aisle. A mother 2 rows back smiled and whispered to her child, "Remember their example." Even some flight attendants passed by with quick, apologetic glances, as though ashamed of their colleagues' actions. Heather remained at the rear, a ghost of her former self. Her uniform felt like a costume she no longer fit into. She thought back to the boarding passes she had scanned. Twice. They had matched. Yet she had insisted on her own assumptions rather than following the facts. She had acted out of bias, not protocol. And now she was paying the price. Back in their seats, Grace and Peter sat side by side, their gift box safely stowed. They did not cheer as the engine spooled up for taxi. Instead, they shared a quiet glance, the kind that speaks of unspoken bonds and shared triumph. They had turned humiliation into vindication, cruelty into consequence. The power of quiet restraint had undone one person's cruelty. Seated behind them, the older passenger with kind eyes picked up a cup of coffee and raised it slightly in a silent toast. Grace caught her eye and gave a respectful nod. The stranger returned the gesture before sipping her coffee. Across the aisle, A businessman closed his laptop and leaned back, arms folded in quiet appreciation of the siblings' courage. As the cabin lights shifted to night mode and the stars blinked outside, the flight attendants resumed service for the remaining crew. Claire moved through first class, offering bottled water and soft apologies as she passed Grace and Peter. Each interaction was a reminder that respect, once lost, can be slowly rebuilt when we choose compassion over prejudice. 30,000 feet above the earth, the Williams siblings settled into their seats, bracing for landing. They closed their eyes for a moment, feeling the gentle, steady hum of the engines as a lullaby of victory. They had turned cruelty into accountability, bias into consequence, indifference into awareness. They had taught a lesson that no training video could impart, that power misused is power lost, and dignity demanded will always prevail. Below, the lights of the city of Chicago glimmered like gold ribbons. Their grandmother's house lay beyond, waiting to envelop them in the warmth of family. Grace and Peter knew that the true gift of this flight was not the plush seat or the complimentary champagne. It was the triumph of right over wrong, respect over hubris, and the certainty that standing firm in one's truth can reshape the world, even at 30,000 feet. Heather's reputation had been built on protocols and policies enforced without hesitation. She told herself that kindness was optional, that firmness commanded loyalty. But as she sat there, the realization hit her. Respect is not something you can demand through authority alone. It must be earned through fairness and empathy. Her career had depended on maintaining control through fear, and in that moment, she understood how fragile control could be when tainted by prejudice. She glanced at the laminated safety card tucked into the seat back ahead of her, not to read it, but to ground herself with something mundane. Her mind flew back to the confrontation. She had asked to see their passes twice, despite the seats being correct. She had spoken harshly, humiliating them in front of other passengers. She had assumed they did not belong, not because of policy, but because of bias she had never examined. That one assumption had unraveled her entire career in a flash. She remembered Ava's face. No yelling, no tears, just stunned disbelief, and Brandon's composed firmness. No raised voice, just a clear statement that they would not move without the captain's order. Heather pressed a trembling hand to her forehead, willing the memory to fade, but it wouldn't. She thought of how easy it had been to wield cruelty, to hide behind a crisp uniform and a stern expression. Yet power misused is power lost. She heard the intercom ding again, slicing through her thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen," came Captain Lawrence's calm voice, "we will begin our descent in approximately 10 minutes. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and the cabin is prepared for landing." The words sounded distant, like they belonged to another flight. The seatbelt sign blinked on with a soft chime. Claire moved through the cabin, checking that passengers were secured. Heather sat unmoving. The command to prepare for arrival felt like an order meant for others, not for her. She no longer belonged to the crew being addressed. She was now an outcast in uniform. The realization made her shoulders sag. She would walk the length of this cabin not as a supervisor, but as someone discarded, every pair of eyes a witness to her downfall. Passengers in first class rose to their feet, gathering belongings, but many paused to watch the corporate contingent. A businessman in a crisp suit leaned against the aisle, arms folded, watching the scene unfold with silent fascination. An older woman with silver hair and kind eyes stared through the window, her lips pressed together in solemn anticipation. Heather realized they weren't just about to deplane, they were about to witness her formal removal. Her fingers dug into her lap, nails pressing into her palms until they hurt. She thought of the power she once wielded with ease, of the habitual point of authority she had taken for granted. Now that power felt hollow, as though someone had cut the strings of a marionette. She swallowed, her mouth dry, as she prepared for a walk down the aisle that would mark the end of her career. Every step would be a testament to the fallibility of authority when guided by prejudice. As the cabin doors opened, the first rays of afternoon sun streamed in, illuminating the polished metal and plastic of the jet bridge. Heather, escorted by security, stepped onto the ramp in uniform, stripped bare of authority. She passed directly under Richard Carter's gaze, the silence between them more telling than any words. Outside, cameras flashed unnoticed by most, but captured for company records, and perhaps for a lesson in leadership training. Inside the cabin, Grace and Peter stood and followed the flow of passengers into the jet bridge. Grace felt the gift box weigh heavier in her arms, but in a good way, as though it held not only a birthday present but a symbol of triumph. Peter walked beside her, his stance as steady as ever. Their exit from that plane marked not only the end of a flight, but the culmination of an unspoken stand for dignity, equality, and respect. Back on the jet bridge, Heather's knees weakened as she approached Richard Carter. She could feel the two security officers flanking her like silent sentinels, each footfall echoed in her ears, a reminder that every decision has consequences. Richard's gaze did not waver. He held out a hand in a gesture that was both dismissive and final. No words of comfort or apology passed his lips. He simply waited for Heather to cross the threshold into accountability. Heather's throat tightened. She wanted to apologize, to cry, to beg for forgiveness. Instead, all she managed was a barely audible, "Sir, I am sorry." Richard nodded once, the faintest concession that he had heard her. Then he turned to the security officers. "Please escort Miss Thompson to administration. Her badge has been revoked. Her uniform will be surrendered after documentation is complete." One officer stepped forward and offered his arm. Heather took it numbly as though sleepwalking. The terminal lights reflected off the polished linoleum, casting long shadows behind her. Passengers waiting in the foyer parted to let her pass, their eyes tracking her every move. Some looked away quickly, unable to meet her gaze. Others watched with a stunned expression, as though witnessing a public figure's fall from grace. Grace looked down at the table, her eyes misting. "That seems harsh," she said finally. Richard folded his hands. "It is harsh, but it is necessary," he explained. "People in positions of power must use that power with fairness and empathy. When they abuse it, the consequences must be as visible as the injustice itself. Only then will others learn that respect cannot be assumed, it must be earned." Brandon leaned forward. "Do you think people will actually learn from this, sir?" he asked. Richard studied his niece and nephew intently. "Some will," he said, choosing his words carefully. "The ones who matter, those who shape the culture, will. Others may not change, but that is not our concern. We have sent a message." Just then a staff member knocked on the frosted glass door. "Sir, the press is gathering near the terminal windows and corporate security is guiding them back," she reported. Richard nodded. "Thank you," he said. He turned back to Grace and Peter. "I appreciate your poise," he told them. "Thank you for refusing to be intimidated. You gave us the chance to do the right thing in full view of the world." Ava picked at her fingernail. "Sir," she said softly, "will there be a public statement about what happened?" Richard paused, considering. "Yes, there will be a company release tomorrow morning. It will state that discriminatory behavior will not be tolerated and that this airline stands for dignity and respect for all passengers." He looked directly at the siblings. "We want the world to know that the actions of one individual do not define our entire company." Their uncle guided them toward a waiting car. The terminal lights reflected off its polished black surface. Richard opened the rear door for them. "I am proud of you," he said quietly. "You have shown what true dignity looks like." Grace slid into the back seat, clutching her gift box as if it were a talisman of hope. Peter followed, closing the door with a respectful click. Inside the car, the air was thick with unspoken thoughts. Two young people had been forced to grow up faster than most adults would ever understand simply because someone refused to see them for who they were. The silence between them felt thoughtful, not tense. They watched the world slide by, maintenance vehicles pulling away from the gate, flashing orange safety lights reflecting in puddles. The mirrored glass of distant terminals catching the last golden rays of the sun. In the quiet corporate lounge the next morning, Grace and Peter sat side by side, the gold gift box between them. Rain dripped softly against the windows as they read Uncle Richard's handwritten letter, thanking them for their courage and promising a full company apology on their behalf. Grace folded the note carefully. She offered Peter a small, tired smile. "We changed everything," she said softly. Peter nodded, eyes bright with resolve. "Yes, we did." Outside the lounge, the world carried on, busy commuters, honking taxis, flashing billboards. But for the Williams siblings, nothing would ever be the same. They had learned that true power lies not in uniforms or titles, but in standing calm in the face of injustice, and they had shown everyone that sometimes the quietest voice is the one that echoes the loudest. As they stepped into the car and settled against the soft leather seats, their surroundings took on a new glow. A jumbo screen hanging above the terminal entrance replayed stills from the viral video. Bold letters proclaimed, "Airline will not tolerate behavior that diminishes the worth of any individual. Respect is not possible, it is policy." No faces, no names, just unflinching truth. The siblings exchanged a glance, sharing the once invisible bond of having shifted an entire culture in a single flight. Across the country, people paused on their morning routines. Some scrolled right past, others lingered on their screens, watching the 6-second clip of Heather Thompson looming over two quiet teenagers. They saw Grace calmly tap her seatbelt, and Peter look straight ahead, a simple act of self-possession that spoke volumes. In homes, in schools, in other airline cabins, passengers and crew alike felt the familiar pattern of silence and assumption break apart. In a corner booth of a small cafe near the airport, Heather Thompson sat alone, hood drawn over her head. A plastic bag of her former uniform rested on the table beside a cup of untouched coffee. She could hear the muted buzz of conversation around her but felt cut off, as though submerged under glass. Her phone lay face down in her lap, buzzing with messages she could not bear to read. Heather's mind replayed that moment over and over. The stern check of boarding passes, the suspicion in her eyes, the sharpness of her tone. Her mistake had been thinking she was above reproach, immune because she kept order and demanded respect. But silence was the sharpest weapon of all, and she had underestimated two teenagers who refused to vacate seats they had earned. Peter finished the last of his orange juice and placed his cup on the side table. He reached across to take Grace's hand. "We did it," he said. She squeezed back. "Yes," he whispered. "It arrived." Grace looked out the window at the gray sky turning to pale gold. A new day was breaking, not only for them, but for every passenger who would now demand respect, for every crew member who would remember that power is fragile when wielded without compassion. For Heather Thompson, the path forward was uncertain. Doors had closed, and whispers followed her even into quiet cafes. Yet the world would remember her as the cautionary example of why dignity must never be taken for granted. For Grace and Peter Williams, the journey continued, back to family celebrations, back to everyday life, forever marked by the flight that grounded more than a plane. They walked forward carrying an understanding that silence can speak volumes, and that standing firm in one's truth can bring the mightiest to their knees.